Good morning, everyone. What a pleasure to be in Stockholm this morning for a wrap-up discussion of the first research cycle of our Observatory on Information and Democracy. I am Camille, I'm the Executive Director of the Forum on Information and Democracy, an organization working across regions to strengthen democratic safeguards in the information and communication space. We coordinate and collaborate with a coalition of more than 50 governments around the world in the framework of the Partnership for Information and Democracy, and a wide network of civil society activists and researchers around the world. 3 years ago, we embarked on quite an adventure, building and hosting an institution designed to give us the best understanding possible of information ecosystems, how they are structured and how they operate, and what is their impact on public debate and democracy across regions. Today, here in Stockholm, we are proud to share some of the key conclusions from this work. We will discuss how these findings can be translated into concrete public policies and reflect on the future of the Observatory, and especially in light of the dramatic changes that have occurred since our report was launched earlier this year in January. I would like to extend my warm thanks to all the colleagues who have joined us in Stockholm today, and especially Grenier, who was the chair of the steering committee, and Mansell, who has acted as scientific director of the first research cycle. And I'm also grateful to the many colleagues that are in the room who are joining us and who will share some of the main conclusions of the report. Of course, this work would not have been possible without some support, and I really want to thank the Postcode Foundation for their support, which has enabled us to build the architecture, build the network, and get to that first big report that we published in January. And I would also like to thank our colleagues from Ripple Without Borders, Sweden, who have always been very helpful in connecting us with the Swedish stakeholders. As I said, the world has changed since January 15, when we published this report, yet our commitment remains very firm. We are committed to advancing multilateralism of democracies built around common principles, including principles of shaping democratic information ecosystems. And this is why, in just a few weeks at the Paris Peace Forum, we will gather with our colleague at the International Fund for Public Interest Media, a high-level conference on information integrity and independent media, with heads of states and governments, ministers gathering to take some very concrete commitments. And I hope that you will also help us in ensuring that these leaders, global leaders, take some concrete commitments. Again, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and I will pass on to Andreas, Eriksson, Secretary General of the Postcode Foundation.
Thank you so much for having us here today. So my name is Andreas Eriksson, and I represent the Swedish Postcode Foundation, and we are very glad to be here, as these topics that we discuss today are very close to our hearts. So for you who don't know the foundation, we give support to many organizations, a broad range of organizations within the civil society, and many are working within human rights and also defending democracies. So I listened to a radio interview the other day with the famous Swedish author Claes Östergren, and he said something along the lines of, when you feel like nothing is going right in the world, you feel distressed and you just want to switch off and go out to the garden and look at the beautiful dahlia. And I think many of us can relate to that, especially with all the dark stories that we see every day in the news and in social media. But we cannot switch off, and we rather feel that we need to do the opposite at the foundation. We need to switch on, and we need to step in. Especially as we have seen in recent years that many donors have stepped back, and especially donors who has been contributing to supporting organizations working with human rights and defending the democracy. So that's why one of our main programs is focusing on this, defending democracy and human rights. So we want to share knowledge, we want to raise awareness, and we want to support organizations within the field. And to be even more concrete, we support organizations helping excluded young people claiming their rights, and we support organizations that protect journalists and human rights defenders. And we also support organizations like the Global Initiative, the Forum on Information and Democracy, that can help us influence policy work. So we know that our democracies are under pressure, and we know that we need stronger safeguards in the global information and communication space, where disinformation and distrust are widely spread today. And so that's why we believe that the forum can help us tackle these challenges, help us with research, help us with dialogue, and help us with collaboration, and also help us with mapping out the risks with disinformation and distrust, but also look at opportunities that we can have from digital tools that can help strengthen our democracy. So, by supporting the forum, we think that we also support the societies that we want to build together. So, thank you for having us here today. I'm really looking forward to the discussions this morning, and I hope that we will have some insights and hopefully some recommendations on how to move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, I'm sure you will, and I will pass now the floor to Erik Larsson from Postcode.
Thank you, Camille. When something is broken, we need to fix it. And today, something is broken, very broken. Advertising revenues are flowing from two tech platforms, from media. Money is flowing from the tech platform instead of going to quality journalism. Public service media is losing resources, and political leaders try to take control over them. Crook states like Russia, like China, and Iran is spreading disinformation. The global information system is right now under attack. And when the information is under attack, democracy is always also under attack. This is why we are here, to take responsibility, to try to fix the things that's broken. So let me warmly welcome you to this international seminar. We may not prepare everything today. To be honest, we have quite actually a big work in front of us. We don't have the tools right now, and we are not so many people that we can fix it today. So we take a minor step today, but on this path, on this road, even a minor step is very important, and I will therefore welcome you all to this international seminar. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Erik. And I would like to pass it on to Robin for some introduction and a representation of the report that we published. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's really a delight to be here, and my enormous task is to try to present an enormous report in 10 minutes. So, the first thing I want to do is to just point out to you that as you see on the flyer, The enormous report that came out in January, thanks to many of my colleagues who are here, is coming out as a book, open access, updated as far as we could do it in November. So thanks to Nordicom, it will be open access. So I just want to draw your attention to that. The reason we did it was at the prodding of some Finnish colleagues who said students can really benefit from this. So I think the intention is really to get it out there to students for teaching purposes. But next slide, please. Okay. The reason I put this very hard to read slide up there is to draw your attention to the fact that one of the big results, unfortunate results of our report on the role of information ecosystems and their contribution to democracy was to discover how hard it is to reflect the global majority world in the results of our work. And what that chart tells you is a tall blue line, that's United States research contributions to our report. So a lot of little countries, but basically the overall finding was that only 22% of the 1,644 citations in the report, 22% were from the global majority world, and that was despite enormous effort to reach out to all parts of the world. So that fact is something that needs to be redressed as we go forward if we're to understand the way information ecosystems are developing. That's just a pretty graphic that shows you some of the prominent ideas, concepts in the report. What I want to do is just reflect a little bit on what I think we would have emphasized more in the report if we were starting now, as opposed to starting when we did start in around October 2023. So the first theme in our report, which was very much focused on information, disinformation, misinformation as a cross-cutting theme. First theme was about media systems, trust, and information integrity. And I think if we were starting again today, we would have emphasized very much the concept of media freedom, perhaps more than we did. We would have emphasized a little bit more than perhaps we did in the report, the structure of the industry. Coming back to your point about the financing of public service media, I think we would have paid much more attention to that. It is in the report, but we would have emphasized it. I think we would have paid much more attention, not so much to the effects of the media, but to who weaponizes information. That was in the report, but it's not just the who as individuals, whether it's Trump and his henchmen, or whether it's politicos in the Reform in the United Kingdom or Ireland, but the institutions as well that support these individuals who are generating and weaponizing information. And I think also we would have paid a lot more attention to the monetization of data all the way through the report. That is there, but it would have played, I think, a bigger role. The second thing that we addressed was AI, information ecosystems, and democracy. And there, we rightly emphasized the human rights issues, absolutely. But I think if we were to start again today, we would have looked more than we did at the AI value chain, the inputs and outputs across the board to the ways in which AI is being developed. We looked at content moderation, particularly in the report, but that is only one facet of the way in which the whole information ecosystem is becoming mediated by technology. And I think the value chain is hugely important. Supply chain is another word for that. I think we also would have paid a lot more attention than we did in the report. I think there's only 2 paragraphs in the original report on copyright issues and AI. That is becoming a huge issue across the creative industries. They may not, just as our news industries are threatened by the developments in information ecosystems, so too are the creative industries across the board, and I think we would have paid more attention to that. And that means we would have paid more attention throughout the report to ownership issues, control of data, and to the biases and discriminations that are built into the systems which underpin information ecosystems today. And then our third main theme was data governance and democracy. And here, I think, actually you'll see this a little bit in the rewritten book as opposed to the report, and it will make one of my colleagues smile. I think we would have put data governance issues horizontally through the whole report, alongside information issues. We kind of tried to do that, but I think in a way, by trying to be quite balanced, if you like, and reflecting a whole variety of research traditions, we were trying to appeal to perhaps a broader audience than we needed to. And in doing so, some of the report perhaps lost a bit of the critical edge. And had we driven some of the datafication issues, data ownership issues, all the way through the report, I think we might have been a little bit more current, if you like. But that's all hindsight. I think one of the important issues that we could have addressed in that area that we didn't spend so much time on is looking at whose voices are not heard in the top-down approaches to governance. Whose voices are being left out when you think about who is participating in developing the AI Act in the EU, for example. Whose voices are not heard when you think about the way in which some of the new legislation, whether it's the Digital Services Act or whatever, is not being implemented in the way in which people hope that it would be. And thinking about the global majority world, who are developing new frameworks for regulating digital systems of all kinds, whose voices are not being heard there. And I think that's something which deserves empirical investigation, which researchers can help with. And I think, too, we also looked at resistance movements, many of them. And one of the big points that we made in the report was that there's just not enough systematic investigation of all of the activist groups who are trying to make a difference, trying to reveal some of the discriminations, the biases, the problems, which lead to the generation of mis and disinformation, and hate speech, which is another area which we didn't address directly. And if we look at what's happened since, well, I guess November in the United States, in terms of the new administration there, what do we see but the proliferation of hate speech? So those are just some reflections on what we might have done if we were starting again. On the first slide, you may have seen a little question mark that said impact. What is the impact of an enormous report like this? How many of you have read it from beginning to end? Just a few. I think my feeling is that a big report like this is a positioning exercise. It is enormously valuable for putting issues on the table and saying, this is what we really need to pay attention to. And my suggestion for maximizing impact as we go forward is that there are all sorts of kind of, I will admit this, fuzzy recommendations about what should be done in the future. Why are they a bit fuzzy? It's because it's an enormous report. And you can't talk about what every country or a group of individuals should do in a big report that is supposed to encompass the global north and the global majority world. So my recommendation is that if we were to take every month one key recommendation and issue and commission an academic who has nothing better to do, or an activist, to write an 800-word blog and get it out. The Observatory could publish it, and you would have a rolling program of updated, topical information reaching a wide audience. But even think about translation into some different languages. Volunteer, not asking for money here. And be able to keep the profile of the kind of engagement which all of you are interested in, to really continue to make a difference in terms of the information ecosystems which we and everyone else are really being forced to inhabit, to bring them closer to the principles of democracy and closer to the defense of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. organizing and charting the path forward with some top priorities for research. I'd like to call on stage our colleagues, Rosemary Santini from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, who will moderate the first panel, Erik and Ulrika Westerlund from the Swedish Parliament, and our colleagues, Maren from the University of Johannesburg, and Jalak Kakar, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Communication Governance at the National Law University, Delhi. Thank you. Maren, the floor is yours.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Marie Santini, professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and I participated in the panel and in the report too. And I invite here the panelists. I don't know if I'm going to say the name the correctly accent, but we have Erik is it right? Grenier, right? Jalak, how do you say it? Jalak and Ulrika Westerlund. Correctly? Fantastic. So our panel is about translating research into policy. And I think it's a very important issue because I'm from academia, and of course, we are very good in admiring problems, but not so good for solutions. So we need to make this shift, and I think it will be very helpful and interesting to discuss with my colleagues here. So I will start with Erik to talk about, as the chair of the Committee of European Union Affairs, how have you seen the shift in the discussion since January this year?
Well, since January this year, we woke up to a news story about the American president wanting to sue the New York Times for, was it $50 billion? That happened since January this year. A lot of things has happened since January, and I think that we have a lot still to come. But one of the points that I would like to make about this is that we continuously see a shift when it comes to legitimacy for information carriers. Let's call it that. We've spoken about media, we've spoken about social media, but I like this information ecosystem term that is being used in this report. I think it's spot on, really. And what I think we can see, and that started before January, but is also carrying on, is that a group of people, which I would like to call maybe academically disenfranchised, rather than uneducated, because I wouldn't like to call them that, have a feeling, and a growing feeling, that is also showing policies all around the Western world, but also outside democracies, that we have people feeling that there is an establishment that is not for them, that doesn't speak for them, and when they got a voice through social media, they utilized that voice. And social media, which is part of the information ecosystem, but is regulated like freedom of speech rather than freedom of press, created an arena where they could give voice to these concerns without filtering. Now, freedom of speech has always been aimed to regulate what can be said and done as far as your voice can carry, maybe with a PA system like we have now, but not further than that. But when social media came along, all of this changed. The freedom of speech could carry around the world, not regulated in the way we decided to regulate freedom of the press, which was designed to carry information to the masses, with the ethical guidelines, with the legal guidelines that came with that. Now this is a hard conundrum because we can, pull back time, but I really like what you said at the end of this. We need to bring these media and information carriers closer to the defense of democracy and human rights. So what I think we can see from January, but also before that, is that we're not masters of this task. We still look backwards rather than forwards. We look how can we conserve what we know is good, rather than how can we tame what we need to tame in order to create this information ecosystem we need to create. We're not masters of this task.
Thank you. And there is another problem now that is we are facing a very hard lobby from big techs against regulation. And at the same time, we see the President of the United States refusing people to enter in the United States because they are expressing their opinions on social media. So it's a contradiction that we need to address in some way. So thank you very much. Admire. In your work, you focus on media freedom and the platformization of news work. What trends are you observing in terms of the influence and the factors guiding journalists today? Is the potential virality of their reporting either an incentive or concern, leading to possible healing effect?
Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank everybody who has allowed us to be part of this platform. Yes, certainly I do focus on platformization of news. It's one of my research interests. But just to say that what we have observed over the last couple of years, especially in the Global South, is that we are increasingly seeing a change in terms of who people actually trust in terms of news. So there's a shift from trusting journalists to trusting social media influencers. There's also a shift from trusting journalists to trusting bloggers and podcasters. And for us, this is a huge concern. Why? Because most of these people that we are calling social media influencers, most of them just rely on the numbers. They have the numbers. They have managed to game the algorithms. They understand the algorithms, and they have read a lot of numbers in terms of people that they reach. But most of the time, they don't really have truthful, credible, verified information that they are sharing. Some of them are pretty much just pushing out their own, sometimes far-right ideas through these particular platforms. And again, something that we've also observed is the disruption of the business model of journalism through platformization. So increasingly, you are seeing a lot of public interest media struggling really to stay afloat. And as one of the speakers said earlier, we are increasingly seeing political actors coming into the picture to try and capture media that are struggling to really get the money to continue to keep the lights on. And that really has created a situation where the media is either in the hands of politicians or is either vulnerable to the whims and caprices of platforms. And I think that really for us is a challenge. And also what we have also seen over the last couple of years, really especially in the Global South, is the way in which especially female journalists are really targeted online. For us, that again, especially technology facilitated gender-based violence against female journalists really is something that is also of concern. That has also meant that some of them have to self-censor themselves when they go online. Some have really gotten out of these platforms because they can't continue to converse on those particular platforms. Because oftentimes when they want to put out their own ideas, they are met with a lot of vitriol, they are met with a lot of hate speech, and that again has created a very difficult kind of information ecosystem for them to continue. But over and above that, what we've also seen over the last couple of years, besides just female journalists being targeted, is the way in which disinformation has also been weaponized on these particular platforms. Mostly again targeting journalists, but also targeting human rights defenders, and that again for us is a cause of concern, because as a result, most people that are supposed to really be defending democracy, promoting democratic ideals, fail then to do their work because they of fear of either being censored or fear of things that can happen to them or their loved ones if they continue to speak truth to power, especially in fragile democracies that we tend to see in the global south.
Thank you very much. And there is even the problem that we cannot audit these numbers from the platforms. We don't know how trustful they are. Jalak, for you. Drawing on the theme of the panel from research to policy, how do you think global majority countries like India and Brazil are approaching policy making in this domain?
Can you hear me? Yeah. I think, moving from research to policy implies that we have the research. And I think Robin actually set that up very well through her slides. I think one thing we realized during the course of this report was there isn't enough research from the global majority. And this is despite, and I would say that a lot of a lot of research programs, they don't even think about the global majority when they're writing global reports. They're so focused on global north research, expecting that global north research and insights apply in all other parts of the world. I think, we as a group, when we approach this report, we're very cognizant of the fact that global north research doesn't apply in different contexts. And each context has different rule of law realities, different political systems, different legal systems, different civil society contexts, different cultural, social, economic contexts. And there was multiple calls for research that were put out where global majority scholars were encouraged to share their research. I know the team did an excellent job of actively going and cataloging research. And this number is after those very, very extensive and strenuous efforts. We can go, it's very important to have research that's grounded in particular contexts. And let's talk a little bit about why there isn't enough of that research. And what can we do as a society, as a sort of a collective of people who are interested in these issues and fixing these issues, to start to, change the tide on this. Philanthropic ecosystems in many global majority countries are not very developed. And even where developed, are generally focused more on questions of, say, child malnutrition or education, and are not being able or in a position to deploy resources towards questions of governance and policy. So local research ecosystems do not have the money to be doing this work. Very often they are reliant on money from more developed contexts. And very often, that is precarious, as we've seen with, global USAID cuts, cuts from the National Endowment of Democracy that funded a lot of this kind of work globally. So many of my colleagues across Latin America, Africa, Asia have had to shut down and let go of 30 to 40% of their programmatic staff because of the shrinking of these funds that are available. The other part of it is, very often when there are these calls for research on contexts within the global majority, you will see that at the end of those calls, when they publish who is selected, very often it is research institutions in the global north who are selected to do work on the global majority, almost like there isn't necessarily the expertise within the global majority to do this work. I think there's something to think about there. I'm not saying all research has to be done within the global majority, but there needs to be perhaps more balance. It shouldn't be skewed so much towards the global north. And even where these projects that are run out of the global north don't include scholars from the global majority. So I think there are many challenges when we're talking about research that is created in the global majority that can be research that goes into policy and action. And I think there are many systemic challenges, but I think what the Forum on Information and Democracy has done, under the leadership of Camille and Robin and Courtney, has really tried to move the narrative forward and overcome some of these challenges. And I think having been very cognizant of these challenges, and I think have done an excellent job in this report of articulating these limitations and the problems of looking at global north research to inform policy action in the global south and the tremendous challenges that can come with that. So I think this report is very useful from the very fact that it's calling out this problem and setting it up for us to think about how to find a solution to this.
Thank you very much. I think it's very important to reflect about what we can do globally and apply locally. So, Ulrika, you have a background in promoting inclusivity, combating discrimination, and advocating for health and rights of marginalized communities. How do you view the interconnection between our work on information ecosystems and these social dynamics?
Thank you for that very interesting question. The notes that I took to prepare for this, almost everything that I pointed down has been said by my colleagues on this panel, so it's kind of interesting that we have we have the same takeaways with us. I also noted especially this huge problem that I think that we are seeing when you brought up the work that I've been doing on health, for example, for the LGBTI community mainly. And this is something that has been under enormous stress and pressure since the kind of complete withdrawal from the US administration. And this is something that is of course creating panic globally. And in that context, and also then since there are so many other health crises that also is going to happen as a result of the US new administration, for example, maternal health in very many countries. The problem of that, we think that few donors are willing to step up to support the work of like democracy, freedom of the press, and even basic human rights for marginalized groups. I don't think that that is something that is going to be prioritized in this new world, unfortunately. So I think we're going to see human suffering as a result of what has happened in the US, and it's impossible for other donor countries, including the European Union, to step up to kind of cover for all that withdrawal. And what I have seen so far from in those contexts, it's very much that democracy, freedom of press, human rights work in general is not going to be prioritized. It's going to be prioritized to try to save lives in the kind of immediate situation. That's where I think that most countries are going to put their money, which is kind of understandable, but I think that we're going to see an enormous setback as a result of that is going to last for decades. I'm sorry I sound very negative, but I think that the impact is very hard to kind of even try to imagine at this point in time. And then everything that is addressed in this report, I also then have not read the full report, I have to say. I kind of looked in the summary. It's enormously valuable knowledge to spread and continue to spread. The problem is, of course, that few people, especially those people who really need to see it, I don't think that they're going to read it and take this knowledge with them in their work. And that's kind of also the whole topic of the report, that so many decisions and policies made by decision makers are maybe not completely founded in the best available knowledge. It's founded in something else that can sometimes be populism or just lack of knowledge, or the need to address something that you see is something that your voters or your constituencies seem really concerned about, even if you yourself kind of maybe know that there are other things that are more pressing but still you're going to have to address what is being put in front of you that is sometimes not based in the best available knowledge.
Yes, very important issue. Thank you very much. I think we open now for a Q&A. Please. Thank you, Camille.
Thanks so much. Can I ask both of the members of Parliament, how would you go about using the research that is in this report to translate it into policy, especially with respect to, you know, the things that you do have control over in your own contexts? And, you know, I know that Sweden has been relatively, you know, insulated, I think, against some of the biggest disinformation threats, right? You know, we know that there is this threat from Russia, et cetera, but, you know, every country has these challenges. So was there anything in the report that you said, hey, this could really inform how we approach, you know, policy making or a specific issue?
But I can mention one, which is kind of the funding to press and the need for a diversity in the available press. And this is something that we have also seen a decrease in, unfortunately, in the Swedish context. There are many local press, like newspapers, that cover Sweden locally that have such very lacking resources, so it's almost impossible for them to cover what local politicians are doing. And this is really bad then for democracy, because the resources put into local politicians making their work and their decisions made to the public, they have way more resources than the local journalists have in their attempts to kind of try and describe these decisions and these policies in a more objective way. And that's a huge problem. And we have also seen a lack of funding for more specialized, diverse, like magazines specializing in particular topics. They have also suffered from some of the recent developments in how the funding of the press in Sweden is being done. So that's something that could be addressed from a political point of where we are. So.
Well, we can quarrel about that if you afterwards. But nevertheless, I think that what I take with me is something I think we've been on the track for some time, and is also reaffirmed in this report, that the real need for accountability by people in a position of power. And by that I don't only mean politicians, I also mean owners of these platforms. And that's one of the points I was trying to make initially, saying that these platforms, under the regulation of the freedom of speech, are basically deprived of accountability as the rules stand, because they made it in 19th century, most of them, the principles. So what I think we need to do in order to create an ecosystem that is actually functioning in Sweden and elsewhere is to make sure that this accountability is being pursued. And I think that's one of the universal things people in general, regardless of where you are in the world, believe in, that people with power should take responsibility for their actions. But we need to discuss the definition of power. It's not only political power, and this is not new. This is why the freedom of the press is designed the way it is, with a publisher taking responsibility for what is printed. But when you short-circuit this through social media and other platforms, you need to create a new way of extracting accountability for ordinary people. And I think we're waiting for a time of enlightenment when we come to this, because when the first car was produced, it didn't have a seatbelt, but then we realized that maybe we need a seatbelt in order to reduce casualties. But you needed a certain number of casualties before people came to that conclusion. What we can do together is try to hasten the process and reduce the number of casualties in the process until we start to realize as a global community that this accountability towards people in a position of power when it comes to distributing information outside the freedom of the press regulations. So I think that's one of the things I take with me. And in a Swedish perspective, I would love to be part of a task force working together in order to mesh together the freedom of speech and freedom of press in the Swedish constitution. I was deputy chair of the Committee on the Constitution for a couple of years and got bitten by the constitutional bug. I love this, and I think that it's entirely possible. And it is entirely necessary in this information ecosystem we live in now, because we live in a society regulated by 18th century rules in a 21st century information ecosystem. The principles can remain the same, but they need to be applied to a new reality, and this is what I bring with me.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, colleagues. In terms of translating research into policy, I would just like to get your opinion. Looking at this research from the perspective of the Global South lenses, when this report came out earlier on in the year, working as a researcher on it, what I did was I shared it with a member of our parliament in the Gambia, who is in charge of education, ICT and media. He chairs that committee. And he was very surprised, he also being a computer scientist like myself, by the very low representation in the global majority. And just as Robin said, only 22%. And he said, oh, parliamentarians should get these documents. So I don't know, because most of the time it's these parliamentarians that usually implement government policies. From the global north, you folks here, how do you see parliamentarians in making an impact? Because if they don't have access, or they are blindsided by not having access, they will still live by this 18th century law. Some of them who don't adhere to the principles of Article 19. So I would like to get your perspectives. Thank you.
I think that sometimes we make the mistake of cutting a few corners when it comes to safeguarding democracy, and I think this is one of the times we do it, because we do research and then we go straight to the legislature and say, how are you going to implement this? That is cutting a corner in the sense that, like we spoke about earlier, the legislature is only going to do what the electorate is telling them to do. And that's one of the cornerstones of democracy, in a way. And we cut the corner in creating legitimacy around these principles, and I think that's one of the things we need to do first. And that's also one of my points when it comes to accountability. We need to make sure that there's a public demand for accountability of people in a position of power, which is not usually recognized as being in a position of power. And when it comes to implementing these, I don't think it's possible, even in a Swedish perspective, to implement new policy on this area unless there is a public demand for it, and that public demand can be created through information. And that's what I mean by saying we need to speed up this process when it comes to legitimacy, to the reforms that needs to be made. Otherwise, we will have what we are seeing now in the European Union when we're trying to cut this corner, by saying that these big tech giants need to implement this and this and this and this and this. And the only thing we get in return is the accusation that we are narrowing down freedom of speech. Now, this comes from the misconception that what we're doing is trying to quash freedom of speech rather than create accountability. And that is the problem with cutting this corner. So my point is that instead of going directly to the legislature, as journalists, but also as politicians, we have a uniquely well-placed role in society to distribute this to more people than the ones directly responsible now. We need to create a public demand for this. Otherwise, what we'll be doing is what thus far has created the crisis of credibility for media outlets and politicians, doing things and people don't understand why. We just do it because we believe it's the right thing to do, but we fail to explain, and we fail to make sure that there is an actual demand for what we're doing. And I think this is what has been the big problem for democracy so far, and the backlash of that is what I previously referred to as the academically disenfranchised people. Now getting a voice, not being very interested in losing that voice. But what we need to create is another way to express that voice with accountability of those in a position of power. So that's my point. So I agree with you, we should make sure that legislators and legislators all around the world get this and start researching it more and trying to do, but this is a process involving the entirety of society, especially those who don't care now, needs to start caring. Because what we know about tyranny, what we know about the lack of accountability is that it creates human casualties, and we need to avoid as many as possible.
Maybe just a quick comment to add. I'm quite new in politics. This is my first round as an elected politician, so I came from civil society before that, and also way before that I came from journalism 25 years ago or something, so I'm no longer a journalist. But I think one of the challenges for politics is that I've seen so many areas in politics where basically everyone agrees that something is a problem. Nobody does anything, probably because it's expensive. Your voters or your constituency don't know about this problem, so they won't re-elect you based on your actions in this particular area. And it's very expensive then, which means that you can't do other things that are more in popular demand. So you will do those things instead. And this is across the political line, I think. It's kind of very risky political behavior to invest lots of money and resources into doing something that almost nobody understands, because your voters will not reward you for this. And this is a problem. It's a huge problem, because then sometimes politicians need to dare to take the lead then to try to inform people on why we have to do this. And also often kind of, this can be in all sorts of areas, like for example, like how should Sweden buy vaccines in the future? Like also, it's not controversial, it's almost no discussion between the parties, but nobody makes reforms in areas that people don't know about. So how do we keep people informed? That's what you're talking about as well. Kind of making sure that people understand what needs to be done and why, and also maybe then care about it. But I think, unfortunately, that in very many areas, not just this area that we're talking about today, the lack of information makes it very, very hard for the ordinary voter person to make an assessment on what is the best way forward. It takes very much resources to try to keep people informed about that. And again, we're back into this little spiral of the lack of resources and how to make sure that people make the best informed choices and decisions based on actual information that is correct.
Yeah, because the paradox is that when the information ecosystem is failing, it's harder to tell people why we should make it better.
Exactly, that's the point. It's kind of an evil circle.
Thank you so much. My name is Elsa. I work with International Development Assistance, and I have a question. Maybe it's mostly to admire Jalak, because we speak a lot about regulation and so a bit top-down. And I'm interested in, you spoke about platformization and how we see influencers. And my question is, if you see, I know there are initiatives to actually educate influencers in journalistic methods and so on. And my question is, if you see an impact from those programs, and that could be a way forward.
All right, thanks a lot for that question. Secondly, I think there's a lot that can be done to try and educate social media influencers in terms of information literacy, but also even ethical ways of sharing information on their platform. But what we are seeing, especially in the global majority countries, that there are no tailor-made kind of interventions like that at the moment. People just wake up one day, they've got a microphone, they've got a good smartphone, and all of a sudden they are shooting videos, they are trending, literally they are trending. And because of that, who are you then to come and tell them that what you are publishing is false? if you say that their crowds or their fans are likely to come after you, and then all of a sudden you become, you know, the target of those kinds of people. So we are seeing a lot of that. So I think there is need in terms of media information literacy campaigns targeting those particular constituencies that are trending right now, so that they can also understand that they've got a responsibility. When they share out their information, they've got a responsibility not only to publish truthful and verifiable information, but also to make sure that they unite communities. Some are very polarizing figures, posing polarizing figures in our communities, actually creating environments where hate speech and many other negatives are really being published online. So there's a lot that needs to be done. And I think that's where media development assistance needs to really be channeled towards, to say, how do we make sure that these constituents that are increasingly becoming popular, increasingly becoming more trendy, how do we make sure that they do their work in the right kind of way? Otherwise, if we don't do that, we create a situation where democracy again is likely to be choked along the way. And I think that is the challenge that we have in the global majority countries most of the time.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Just another point to add is very often the problematic information that's flowing through these platforms benefits the political elite and cements their power. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is how do you control this information flow? Because very often the people in power are not interested in sort of regulating or controlling this kind of information. So it creates a bit of a catch-22. And you can have media literacy campaigns, and that's sort of a bottom-up approach of empowerment. But I think along with that, you need sort of a strong media ecosystem that's active in traditional media channels, because very often misinformation is also spread through broadcast and radio and not just online. You need a strong multi-plural sort of media ecosystem. You also need a strong civil society and activism sort of ecosystem. You need a strong academic ecosystem. I think all these parts of the ecosystem have a role to play and come together. So it's not only media literacy campaigns that can work, but you have to seed and empower various actors in the ecosystem, and then that all sort of comes together to start to create some balance in our society.
And maybe we need technology literacy too. Please.
My question is mainly for policymakers. My reflection is that research is not just one homogeneous basket. And one of the things we learned during this report is that there is a lot more money going into research, which is essentially tech push. Push it into education, push it into health, push it into the environment. Don't be critical of some of the consequences of doing so. And then there is research, which is more on the critical end of the spectrum. And so the question for you is, how do you discriminate, or can you discriminate between what is classed as expert knowledge, when the experts a lot of the time these days, and I draw on my own experience, are people who are scientists or technologists who are pushing the technology. They're not very interested in the markets. They're not very interested in the structure of the industries, whether it's media or whether it's AI. And they come along with a lot more money and big, high-impact publications and say, look at me, I've got the answers for your problems in the ecosystem. And then there are others who are less well-funded, often suppressed in many countries, having their funding withdrawn, yet they have very interesting and potentially helpful things to say. So when you're looking at these difficult issues, how do you discriminate between whose research you're going to pick on? Thank you.
That is enormously difficult because it's I don't know about my colleague here, but I have to admit that reading research is maybe not something that I am able to do very often. It's very often then like a glance or something that is hopefully then, for example, like Sweden has this system of making public investigations, like independent investigations before you change laws, for example. And those are supposed to take like available research into account. Hopefully they have done so. So it's very often that you trust the judgment of somebody else. So maybe not me myself. And of course there are colleagues who are more informed about particular areas that we know more about, so you can discriminate easier then. But it is very challenging, I would say. And I don't think that politicians are more resourced or better equipped to make sure that we kind of have all the available and relevant research at hand before making all the decisions. I hope that that will be the case, and I hope that we most of the time make decisions based on that, but it is challenging because you can sometimes see that people who are the most resourced ones have a stronger voice, obviously, and they have a higher chance of reaching also politicians and other policymakers. I think it would be naive to not admit that that is the case. But of course it's our responsibility to try to make sure that we have the best available information, but it is a challenge.
I think that I agree with everything my colleague just said, and I would like to add that I think one of the problems with the Swedish culture is that we have this very strong belief that no one is better than anyone else, and definitely not politicians. But I think this is one of the main roles of a politician, is to weigh information and value information and try to make good decisions. Now that is also a key competence needed in every politician. I won't claim to be the best at this. A lot of people are better than me. But I think that that's one of the things that we, as at least Swedish politicians, I wouldn't want to make myself a voice for politicians all over the world, but we as Swedish politicians have been very bad at communicating as our role to the Swedish public. So a lot of the time I get the perception that people believe that being a politician is not that hard. It's just anyone who walks in from the street could do a better job than the people in office. I'm not saying they're wrong. Some of our colleagues definitely. But my point being is that this is also something that needs to be taken into account when electing representatives, the ability to do this. And we need to be focused on doing this role, because it is hard, and not being eaten up by the people with a strong voice. They're not always rich, and that's one of my points when it comes to people with power. Again, they're not always rich, they don't always have a big corporation behind them, but they are very loud. So loud that you can't hear any other perspectives. But then it is always our role to double back and say, okay, but what about this? And that's not something you do just because you believe you're that sort of person. That's something you do because you have learned and you've created that competence and critical thinking. So yeah, it is a very hard job to do, but it can only be done by elected representatives believing that it's their role. And not everyone does that, to be honest.
Thank you very much. I think we don't have more time. Thank you very much for all the panelists. Very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thanks to our panelists. I think we touched on a lot of very important points, but we'll turn now to our second panel. Again, going back to the main takeaways of the report that has already shed light on specific issues, I'd like to call on stage Minaurovitz from the University of Helsinki, our colleague Mansell from Observatory, and some of the authors of the big report, Flavia Dorad, Théophile Benoit, and Emily Tucker.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you from my behalf. I'm Nina Aslama-Horowitz from the University of Helsinki. I'm one of the lucky ones who will be able to use the book with my students in January. discuss the report with our students, but also brief in a round table for stakeholders, so media representatives, representatives of the ministries, what this report means. And in this panel, I hope we will take a deep dive into some more insights beyond the sort of broad insights and gaps that we've learned today with some experts. We have expertise in AI and discussions around AI with their field. We have expertise in disinformation studies in Europe and globally with Flavia. We have expertise about data and surveillance with Emily. And we have expertise about ICT for development, digitalization for sustainable development with Mansell. And this as a background. So I would love you, dear panelists, to give a 2-3 minute view on what you think were the most important takeaways, maybe even surprises of the report. And I would like to also mention that Emily, Flavia and Phil were actually the rapporteurs, Phil and Flavia for media and Emily for the data. So you've really taken a deep dive into the report. But Mansell, maybe I start with you. Would you like to share some of your key takeaways from your perspectives of the report?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think one of the key takeaways was the lack of equity and inclusion, especially within the global majority. And one thing I looked at, in 1989, Sir Tim Berners-Lee discovered the World Wide Web. It went public in 1993. In 1994, we had the genocide in Rwanda, and it was propagated by radio, traditional media. It was radio that they used to get a lot of people who to kill Tutsis and stuff like that. And I come back to 2006. Times Magazine said, you, as Person of the Year, man or woman, because of content that was being generated then. And I looked at it, I said, why is there a lack of inclusion and equity in this report? It's not that researchers didn't try, but we have a lot in the global majority who just feel that those who control the media, who just feel that the narratives has to be said from one perspective and from one lenses. And looking at it deeper, I feel that the role of traditional media has not left us. We have to engage more with grassroots community radios. And what I've started doing within my Gambia is a small country, 2.4 million people. I work a lot with empowering women on digital inclusion programs. It's translating aspects of this reports that will influence them and giving it to community radios in the communities. And I think that is where we can bridge the inclusion and create equity. So that's my take. Thank you.
Wonderful. So while we are not looking backwards, as Erik said earlier, we want to also take something that we have in the past, for instance, community media, and take it forward. Flavia, your key takeaways as a rapporteur for the media in the report.
I want to point out some of the challenges that we identified in the report, especially for the governance of information ecosystems, or health in information ecosystems as well, at least. We found a cluster of challenges related to news media and the current fragility of news media from multiple perspectives. One is the wildly varying level of trust across the globe. A second is the financial instability. A third is vulnerability to pressures not only from the government or politics, as you'd expect, but also a lot of complex pressures that stem from platformization and the power of the digital platforms. A second cluster of challenges were related to mis- and disinformation and the respect to human rights. We've seen that experiences encountering disinformation vary a lot across the globe, and there is the risk to fall into authoritarian measures, censorship, but also private censorship from the platforms, which is equally problematic for human rights. And in terms of fighting disinformation in practice, another problem that we identified is that evidence of the effectiveness of measures is sometimes sparse. In certain circumstances, it's also contradictory. One of the pieces of advice or action takeaways that we have in the report is that we should also pay more attention to the context in which this information is created, to the actors and their motivations. On the intricacies of the local context, because currently a lot of efforts focus on information itself, on technological measures, but that's only a part of the problem.
Thank you very much. Then from the focus of media to focus on data, Emily, your key takeaways, surprises, pointers.
Can you all hear me? So because of the political context I'm coming from, I work in the US at a university in the US, I have to start with a disclaimer, which is that everything that I say today is my own opinion, my own analysis, and does not reflect anything about the point of view of my home institution, which is Georgetown University. So, sort of on point for the theme today. So the goal of the research that we did on data governance for this report was to relate all of the evidence that we were gathering about the overarching problem of misinformation and disinformation to evidence that we gathered about the ways that political communities are trying, or in some cases not trying, to restrain data practices through law, through policy, or through community practices. And I cannot summarize everything or even most of what we found on that point in 2 minutes, but I will share with you what, from my perspective, was the big takeaway from that research. And I'm not sure that the report articulates this in great depth, but I think it's sort of what I learned or what my reflection was on the research that I did for the report, which is that it's going to be very, very difficult to do anything meaningful or systemic about misinformation and disinformation if we are not contesting datification, if we are not contesting digital infrastructure. And in order to do that, we have to contest the power of the tech companies. So it's not, mis and disinformation is not an isolated problem, it's part of the larger problem of the political economy of data and datafication. So of course, this is the one thing we are told we are not allowed to do. We can have 100 conferences about algorithmic discrimination, we can have dozens of rounds of policy making, well in some places we can have dozens of rounds of policy making about data privacy, we can have a whole generation of PhD students studying AI alignment, whatever that is, but we cannot tell corporations, we cannot place limits on corporations when it comes to the kinds of human activities that they can turn into data, how much of that data they can amass and control, or the types of sectors and industries where they can embed data dependency and algorithmic dependency on corporate products, on proprietary technology. So the report describes some of the many ways that that major corporations are making it impossible for political communities to contest data. So for example, it describes several instances of multi-million-dollar lobbying campaigns to interfere with particular pieces of legislation. But I think that the bigger reason that it is so hard to contest data is just that the data dependencies are really so far gone already. So that at the point where we are discovering what's at stake, the degree of political capture is already quite extreme. And so, you know, if the question being asked is, how can academics and NGO professionals and experts persuade policymakers about the necessity of regulations to ensure the integrity of information ecosystems? To be quite frank, I am not persuaded that that is a real question at this point. It's a framing that concedes so much at the outset that it's sort of the battle is sort of lost in the setup. But if the question is, how can political communities resist systems of communication which really reflect and entrench corporate profit-making incentives to create spaces where genuine political deliberation can happen? That is indeed an important question, an interesting question. It is the question. And the report includes several examples of communities that are doing that. You know, it's always on a small scale. But that's because it isn't ultimately a question of policy. It's a question of politics in the kind of original Aristotelian sense of politics.
Thank you, Emily. Phil, you're expert in claiming expertise around AI, but also information ecosystems. What are your takeaways from the report as a rapporteur?
Yeah, I really wanted to take a step aside because I think the main takeaway for me was really about the relationship between policy and academia. And it's funny because we started writing the report with really concerns about the effects of social media on the media ecosystem, right? And so when we're looking at the chapters on the media, we gathered a group of academics working obviously on the media, and a very classic theme in media scholarly is the question of media ethics. And this is a debate that has been going on for decades now, trying to understand to what extent a single piece of content has any form of influence on the behaviors of individuals. And the conclusion of that kind of scholarly debate over decades is that we don't really know. We still don't know exactly whether there are strong effects with the circulation of information in societies. And this was, so if you take an example, for instance, you take vaccine hesitancy, the question is, will someone stop taking vaccines because they've read an article about it? And you can say, well, yeah, obviously this has an influence, but you have tons of intermediaries that could also have an influence on that decision. They read the article because a friend of them recommended it to them, or because they were interested originally in that issue, and so the causal effect is very hard to pinpoint. So going back to the question of social media effects, then it was really difficult because one of the questions we're asking is, you know, are social media causing polarization? Did social media bring Trump into power? And we want causal relationships to understand the role of social media in transforming these media ecosystems and setting the scene for where we are today. And so the main conclusion for me was we turn to science for causal relationships, and I think the contribution of the report is also showing that there is much more than causal relationships in the work that academics do to try to understand what matters in societies. And on this is really turning from, and this is a quote from a sociologist, a French sociologist, Bruno Latour, who really wants us to move from matters of facts, so trying to debate what's true and what's causal in the world, to matters of concerns. And I think the role of academia in a debate that is so topical, like the one of the effects of social media on media ecosystems, is that we see that there are tons of concerns, and academia helps understand what these concerns are and why they matter to society. So the questions of privacy, the question of equity, the question of power and distribution of power within societies. And on this, we have a lot of evidence of the ways this is unfolding and why it matters. And I think this is really a contribution which is turning for policymakers to turn to academics, not only to find a relationship, but also to understand why things matter in the society that we live in.
Thank you. You brought to mind something that I find to be maybe the most powerful for me personally as an academic, but also as an academic who tries to work with stakeholders, is that we very seldom have a common language. And the UN has brought about the concept of information integrity. What does that really mean? And this report breaks it down to sort of digestible fields or areas and gives examples. And following that, dear experts, as we have you here, what would be some concrete ways to look forward towards that information integrity? Concrete examples that are already happening now that you witnessed or you came across reading this report, working with this report, working with stakeholders and the report that you could recommend, you could give as an inspiration to activism, advocacy, policy making, or research? Concrete examples of good practices towards information integrity for the future.
I think if I look at it from looking at the report and looking at what has recently happened in terms of information integrity, let us take last week Tuesday we had the Grand Resilience Dam in Ethiopia that was recently opened last Tuesday, and there was a lot of disinformation coming from Egypt, coming from Sudan about the effects of the dam with the people. When there was a lot of environmental facts that has proven that this new dam will not affect any water flows, just as you had the Aswan Dam in Egypt. You know, and there was very good evidential facts to buttress that claim. But if you look at what was coming from the Egyptian press, and you look at what was coming from the Sudan, now we have Sudan as a failed state, it was just hitting on Ethiopia that they were doing something that was wrong. You know, but it was good the way Ethiopia handled that media information by giving a lot of integrity that was factual, based on scientific evidence. And I think that is what, and it was coming from academics, so they should be going to grassroots radio stations as far as Tigray. So when I look at this report in terms of information integrity, and I relate to the story I told earlier, we have to do more to link academics with civil society organizations like mine who work at the grassroots level. You know, there's still a big disconnect between that, and I think academics too have to be able to reach out because they come up with evidential data, and we as practitioners on the field, we deal with people at the bottom of society. You know, we can tell you what happens in a little village in New Mill in South Sudan and Gambisara in the Gambia and stuff like that. So we have to have that linkages. I think, to me, it will make information integrity stronger because academics have a lot of information based on research. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think as an academic, my call is to all academics, not only do the politicians need to read our reports, but we need to reach out and in forms that are digestible, as given the example of the report and its policy briefs and executive summaries. Flavia, you worked with, for instance, the European Commission, the NATO. What are your sort of positive, concrete, forward-looking takeaways in that kind of collaboration?
Well, to start presenting the topic, I want to go to the concept of resilience, to this information, which is covered somewhere in the report. I don't know where, but I know for sure that we included a discussion about the factors that impact resilience. And those factors can become examples of good practices. So it isn't only a question of the media system per se. Social factors are equally important in preserving information integrity. In which way? For instance, trust in the media, trust in government are factors that can increase resilience. Countries that allocate resources and know-how in countering hybrid warfare, including information warfare and foreign interference in elections, are also countries that are more resilient to disinformation. That's what research indicates, at least. From my personal experience with projects in EU-funded or NATO-funded projects for countering disinformation, I can say that media literacy works. Research also tells us that there are some conditions in which media literacy works, but we conclude that it cannot be treated as a single solution or a universal solution to the question of disinformation, but it is an important pillar. The problem is that in many countries media literacy is not a significant part of the curriculum, is not formalized enough, is not adequately resourced. So in terms of good practices, I want to quote any country, for instance, northern countries, that include media literacy from a very early age, and that matters. The problem with media literacy is that it needs to take some time to show effects at societal level, and it cannot work alone without looking at other factors, including digital platforms. Investments in robust public service media is also shown to be very important, and investing in the diversity of the media ecosystem. And going back to the question of trust is also central. So if you are able to build a society in which people can trust their politicians and their journalists, at least to a moderate amount, that's a strong advantage.
Thank you, Flavia, and maybe we also need more literacy about data as lay people, as media and communication technology users. And what are your takeaways, some forward-looking positive examples that we could get inspired by?
Have you all heard of the Data Workers Inquiry? Has anyone heard of it? Write it down if you haven't. So this is an organization that is currently hosted by the Distributed Artificial Intelligence Research Institute, DARE, and that's Tamit Gebru's organization. Tamit, if you have heard of her, you've probably heard of her because Google fired her for writing that stochastic parrots paper. And so she started her own organization, and they're hosting just some incredible projects that are right on this theme. So the Data Workers Inquiry references Marx's Workers' Inquiry, and it applies those principles to data work. And so it funds research by data workers all over the world with a focus on data workers in global majority countries. And they do research on data work while they are employed as data workers, which is incredibly risky, especially because many of them are extremely poorly paid and in incredibly precarious circumstances, precarious economic and political circumstances. But the research that they're doing is just absolutely amazing. We flew a bunch of them in for our Color Surveillance Conference. It's a conference that the Privacy Center hosts every year or every other year now. And it was by far the most exciting session of the conference. And you can actually, on our website, you can see video from that session. But I think that is that kind of research, which is being led by people who are directly affected by the problem of misinformation and disinformation and the problem of datafication, but is at an incredibly high level of rigor and sophistication. And if you have any political power, if you have any academic power, if you have any monetary power, give them money, invite them to come speak at your institution, share their work with everyone that you know. So that's my favorite example.
Thank you. Phil, your favorite example?
Yeah, so what I looked at the most in the report were questions of trust in the media, and I think a few points on this is, first of all, the importance of fact-checking, although there are debates on, whether it was the extent to which it works, etc. I mean, one of the reasons why it's important is because politicians and people in power know that they can be fact-checked, and this is already a very important contribution to the circulation of information in democracies. Another thing is the way journalists report on the news. Like, a lot of evidence shows that one of the reasons why people would distrust journalism is because when they've been to an event, they feel that there is a discrepancy between how they've experienced that event and how journalists portray it. So this is a very practical yet very hard recommendation, but which is just writing only on the topics that are being covered and trying to be, to write so that people don't feel there is a disconnect between their experience and how it's being covered. And then a very macro observation is going to the question of mis and disinformation. The problem is really identification to elites, and it's the fracturing of societies by political, powerful people who would potentially have interest in disseminating disinformation. And I think that this is very striking, obviously, in the United States. So I think here, what's worth noticing is like information doesn't circulate because it's true. Like, partiality is not the main driver of why information circulates in societies. A lot of evidence shows that it's because of identity, right? And so identity, the thing that matters is you will circulate information because someone that you trust or because someone you identify with wants to circulate that information. And so we can't say enough how important it is for people in power, highly visible people to have an attachment to objectivity and to the correction of facts. So once you say this, it's really easy to say, and the question is why would people have an interest in voluntarily spreading misinformation? And this is really I feel the very important question in trying to move forward and prevent further polarization and circulation of disinformation in societies that are not as affected yet as it can be in the US, for instance.
Thank you, and I've heard from also many researchers and activists and advocates that just generally knowledge about epistemic, so knowledge communities, we don't know how different communities function, what the motivations are, and how could we, for instance, create literacy to different kinds of communities so that it really meets their needs. But now I'd like to open the floor to questions. Please tell us who you are and whether the question is targeted to one of the panelists or both.
Sure, thanks. My name is Camille. I'm the Chief Executive of the Swedish Internet Foundation. And as it happens, we run a couple of the largest media literacy programs in Sweden targeting youth. So we reach 70% of youth between 10 and 15 in their school environment. But also the larger population, we reach roughly 50% of Swedes every year with basic knowledge about the internet and what happens on the internet and what you can do. So I just wanted to contribute an observation, which is we started off maybe 20, 25 years ago thinking the internet would be this platform of, that would further democracy in the world, that would open up societies. And that was indeed the early stages of the internet. We reached rural regions across the world with knowledge. It was a great sort of starting point. But then we had the next wave, which were social media influenced, and we can see that suddenly we have much more information in the world, but very few proper insights. So the more information we have, the less insights we seem to gain. And right now we're on the verge of an AI-infused world, where we're going to see AI-created content being much more proliferated through the ecosystems than ever before. So we're going to see a world where humans take a much smaller part in creating public debate. And I just wanted to get your opinion on that, because I think that's maybe one of the most horrific scenarios we can see before us.
Excellent question, excellent point. Who wants to start?
I think I've been working a lot on the policy network on AI for the Internet Governance Forum. And one thing I can say is that I always tell people that no matter how far, since I'm involved with the ethics and standards, because what you have just said revolves around ethics and standards in terms of AI. I think we all know that we'll still have data that are biased in a certain way, and we still have a lot of human intelligence having a big play in the field. So I don't think the way a lot of people have looked at AI that is going to disrupt the innovative systems of what technology is doing or how information is flowing. Where I see the problem is its effects on the creatives. Because anybody can sit somewhere in San Francisco and just get a song from somebody and recreate something, and then you have a lot of infringes in terms of privacy and data protection. You know, but when I look at it like within academia, information sharing and journalism, generally, human beings will still be on top. They will still dictate the narrative. It might be difficult. A lot is coming up, but I tell you, if you look at the pattern, most of the complaints are coming from the creative industry. That's my feeling.
if I may. I think AI changes the landscape of disinformation in multiple ways. One is the use of deep fakes. This has become very cheap and very efficient, but that's only one side of the problem. The other one is that AI can be used in each stage of the architecture of a disinformation campaign, from surveillance of the environment till, fake amplification in a later stage, fake amplification of the disinformation narratives that were created. And there are some very interesting reports that detail how AI is used in each step. Another recent development that I find very worrisome is related to the results they give the users. There is evidence that disinformation actors have put in place websites with almost zero traffic and web pages or Twitter accounts with almost zero followers, which automatically publish thousands of articles per day in order to flood the internet with pro-Russian narratives. And when regular users ask AI chatbots about different topics, they will receive answers that reflect the flood of misleading information that's being placed automatically online. They tested a number of very popular generative AI bots, and they found out that 1/3 of the replies reflect misinformation narratives that are being put up there like this. So I think regulation like the AI Act is very necessary, but at the same time, as you know, there is a lot of resistance to that on the basis that it hinders innovation, which may be a problem. I think it's not to be taken lightly, but at the same time, we can't live in a new wild, wild west in terms of AI development. We already lost momentum with the rise of the digital platforms and the rise of social media. If we do the same with AI, I think the consequences would be equally dire, or maybe more.
Emily, what's your view? Is the fight lost, or can we still do something?
Oh, I don't know how to answer that, so I'm just going to respond to something that this gentleman said. So you said that we now have a proliferation of information, but not insight, right? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing that stood out to me. That's something that I feel heartbroken about. And I think that it's a problem, even if the nature of the information being disseminated is good. What we would all agree is good, even if it's accurate, even if it's high quality. I still think that having good information flowing through our information ecosystems is not necessarily evidence that democratic self-governance is happening, right? Or that democratic deliberation is happening. And it doesn't even necessarily make that work that should be happening in the political community more possible. Everyone hopes that it would, but it doesn't necessarily. And in the US, it's especially problematic because one of the reasons we're having such a hard time regulating tech companies is that the Supreme Court has said that money is speech. And because another way to, if you translate that into tech company language, that means data is speech. And so, yeah, if data is speech, then it's hard to use the fundamental legal frameworks, the constitutional frameworks, to protect the kinds of human deliberative activities that are actually constitutive of the political community, right? The thing that we want people to be doing together to constitute themselves as a people. That's really what speech. That's really why we put speech rights in the constitutions, to make that ongoingly possible. And instead, speech has been emptied out of any of that content. It's not just that it's not that, it's this other thing. It's the right of tech companies to essentially turn the population into a vehicle for wealth extraction. And so, yeah, that's a very unhopeful note to close on, but what you said, that particular aspect of what you said really resonated with me, and I think that, unfortunately, if the US doesn't do something to really radically rein in the power of tech companies, it's going to be very difficult to do something globally.
they feel hope or despair?
Yes, well, I have three points on AI. The first one is we need to talk about its environmental footprint, and this is really, even in questions about media, like the point you raise is the fact that AI is being pushed as a service in all of your search queries on Google, for instance, to access the news, and part of this is environmental. This has huge and very important environmental concerns.
And the news is now being created by AI as well, right? So it's an AI poisoning in that sense.
Exactly. So, but that's just in the background, like there is an environmental consideration to make, and in all debates about whether it matters and whether we should have AI for the news or whatever, this is really something to take into consideration. The second point is, I think one of the concerns with AI is the fact that, or to take a step back, the way facts were produced up until now in modern societies were within institutional contexts, right? So you have scientists that gather other scientists, communicate on their methods to do it. You have journalists that have deontology practices to construct facts. It's limited, it's never completely perfect, it can be contested, etc. But you have these institutional settings. What happened with social media is these institutional settings were already starting to be challenged by influencers that come outside of these institutions and that relay facts and construct facts themselves without the support of these institutions. AI is making this, taking it to another level where you just extract facts from whichever the source is without necessarily paying attention to the institutional settings in which they have been being produced. And I think this is really a concern. There is potential hope because you could design AI systems that also pay attention to, what is the source and what are kind of the assumptions that are being made to construct such facts. So you could think of ways to talk about this. But this is really a concern in my opinion. And then the last point is another concern, which is just how to study these systems, right? So up until now we had access. At some point, we had some access, which was very limited to data or to social media. Now it's even harder, and with these systems, it's not even public information anymore. So even if you have a deal with OpenAI or whichever AI provider, what does it mean to study these systems and how people relate to the news in these systems is very, I think, very complicated. So yeah, these are the three kind of issues I see with AI.
I think we have to look well at the regulation of AI. If you look at what the European Union has done with the GDPR, they are also doing it well with the EU AI Act. And I think regulation will really play a big role because at the end of the day, no matter how we view AI, majority of the 8 billion people that live in this world, majority of them live in the global south or the global majority. And those ones, if I look at most of the Gen Z populations that are working with them, they are using it for positive goods. They are using it to see how AI can help them in better decision making. So in as much as there's a lot of buzz, because now you go to a lot of conferences, everybody's saying AI this and that. But speaking from the global south, when I look at myself, when I look at my contemporaries on what they are using AI to do in Africa, in terms of health, in terms of climatic change, in terms of reaching to farmers and stuff like that, I'm happy. We don't face the problems of deep fakes because within our societies in Africa, we have that respect for morality. So we should also take into the constant fact that the majority are trying to use AI to improve their lives. That's the last thing that I would like to add to.
Thank you. Erik, I believe you wanted to comment?
Thank you. It's a question maybe to Flavia and to Emily, and maybe all of you. When it comes to literacy, one of the feelings I get is that the older generation trusts a little bit too much what they hear and see, and the younger generation being the target of the education of media literacy stops believing in anything. And it is then bereft of truth as a concept in a way that is anything goes basically because nothing is true. How do we combat about this, because when I meet young people in Sweden talking about this, they say, well, we see this, but we don't believe in anything anymore because everything is fake. Now, that's not media literacy, that is nothing really.
This is a very good point. This is one of the ways in which the discourse about fake news backfires or tends to backfire to create this type of generalized skepticism. For instance, in the case of youth, one of the problems that I noticed, but this is just my personal experience, it's not necessarily a piece of research, but from my experience with my students, the way in which they fall for fake news, for instance, is first of all being idealistic, like we were all in our 20s, but they lack a lot of life experience that can help them judge some narratives in context. I think an emphasis on civic education in conjunction with media literacy could help them make sense of the information landscape. That's something that maybe is lacking in my country. At the same time, older generations are vulnerable in their relationship with technology. One of the messages that some media literacy campaigns try to push is that young people should take their know-how in their homes, in their families, and try to spread it to the older generations as well. These are ways in which we can work together as a family, maybe in clarifying some issues. Romania, for instance, is a heavily polarized political setting at the moment, and a dialogue between the generations is made difficult because of its very different ideological options that the youth have, or many of the youth have, compared to their parents, especially the educated youth. And of course, there is a need for great attention to the vulnerable groups, not only age-related, but all types of vulnerabilities. They are still being left behind in terms of media literacy. There are ways in which you can cultivate trust, but one of the challenges that we identified in the report as well was that media organizations lack, as I said, financial stability. They have to make a lot of compromise. If they are sometimes dependent of cash flows from governments or from the platforms, and they have to do some compromise. They also have to do editorial compromises because they need to follow the social media logic. I think young people can observe these changes, and indeed they feel they cannot turn to professional or mainstream journalists, they cannot turn to information on the internet. If we are able to solve step-by-step these issues, I think trust will increase as a consequence or a byproduct of our efforts to improve these issues.
So I have a very Luddite answer, which I think probably made me no friends. But you said you young people don't think anything is true or that anything matters. And I think that is, a little bit of an overgeneralization, but I know what you're talking about, and I see that with my own students and people in my own community. And I think that, and you said, what can we do about it? I'm not sure who the we is, but if I had the power to kind of prescribe a medicine for this, it would have two parts. The first part is read great books. And I don't know, my progressive friends would roll their eyes if they heard me saying that, but great, deep, complex literature is transformative and liberatory. Homer, Cervantes, Shakespeare. So I would give them all great teachers to guide them in learning how to read great literature. That's one. And then on the other side is be engaged with your local community. Know who your neighbors are, know what they need in their lives, and have a practice of being like small p political with them, and see where that takes you.
Thank you, Emily. It's time to close this panel. My biggest takeaway has been one of hope, because we have created an amazing network of scholars and activists and practitioners from different expertise as examples here. So let me thank you for that personally, and also on behalf of the audience, thank you very much, and thank you for your questions and participation.
Bringing all this perspective and all these people together also needs a little bit of work, and so I would just like to take 1 minute before we wrap up with Camille and Courtney to thank all the many colleagues who have played an important part in all this process, namely Erik Boyer, who headed the Observatory, Eva Grenier, who worked with her for a long time, and also my colleagues who are here today, Lou Terzian, who played a very crucial role in gathering all of us together, Leila Lorenson, who is also accompanying us and trying to sustain all this work, Guillaume, who is here and who will wrap up the session, and of course our colleagues from RSF, Adi and Katarina, who have been really instrumental, also providing us with this beautiful setting for these beautiful conversations. Thank you so much to all of you, and now for some final remarks, also putting all that research and all that data into the current context that we are in. I would like to call on stage Gian Tribati, who has joined us as Senior Advisor for the Observatory, and of course Grenier, the Chair of our Steering Committee. Thank you.
Thanks, Camille, and hi everyone. We just wanted to cap this excellent conversations with a short conversation with Courtney. So Courtney, we have heard about the takeaways, our colleagues on their takeaways from the report, but what are some of your reflections that have not been addressed already that should be on the top mind of researchers and policymakers, and what can be the future path for OID from here?
Thanks so much for that question. First of all, amazing report, amazing conversation. Interesting that the word competition, market, didn't come up at all. Monopoly didn't come up. And yet we know that competition authorities around the world and even courts in the United States have found that the tech platforms we're all talking about monopolize the markets in which they operate. And that is a key fundamental issue that I think this report alludes to and kind of talked a little bit about, but could do more. And one of the things I think that I appreciated about the information ecosystem approach is that it is a systems level approach. Democracy is a system. And so while it's very important to talk about the individual and how the individual receives information, I think we let ourselves off the hook if we focus too much on media and information literacy at the individual level about how individuals receive information. Yes, that's important. There's a role for the individual in the ecosystem because of course they live in that. But this is about the system, the systems in which we live and we receive information. And the fact is that those systems are monopolized by American tech platforms and by, in many countries, governments over the media system. And I really appreciated that there is a role for both media systems and social media, search, tech platforms in this report. But I think the problem is even more acute than we understand. We see threats from the American administration against Europe for trying to regulate their information systems, right? For trying to have the Digital Service Act, the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, equating regulation of the market for speech with censorship. Doing that in Brazil. I mean, Brazil is actually the only country in the world that has stood up to American attacks and banned Twitter, which is not great, but at the same time, we are in a very different situation now. And so, I think that we need to pay more attention to the systems level and the interaction of the market in the information ecosystem. And some people don't like the term ecosystem because it implies that it's natural, but I like ecosystem because I think it implies that both there are natural conditions and there are systemic and man-made creations. So there's the market, there's the private sector, there's the public sector, and individuals live within ecosystems. And, we focus on the media because they are these, core species, really, foundational species in that ecosystem. But it allows us to look at all of these players, but I do think we need to spend a lot more time looking at market dynamics and competition, because so far, I come from a human rights and journalism background. I now work at a political economy think tank because our normative tools don't work in an era when norms are being destroyed and actively dismantled by the United States and right-wing parties around the world. So I think we need to look at where do we have hard law. So far, we've seen competition authorities intervene in information markets to structure a fairer playing field in Australia and Canada, little steps, but I think we could pay more attention to those dynamics as we think about where we need more research and where we need more policy making.
Thank you for putting that so nicely, and of course, it is quite bleak, but that's why we think that the work that we do at the Observatory is important, and we're so glad to count on your support. This brings me, so you've been a part of the Observatory since quite a while now. You were also there at IGF 23 where we launched the first research cycle. How do you see, what do you think would success look like 5 years from now? What should YD be doing? What would you like to see?
I would like to see, from really the first panel, is the link between research and policy, and for the research agenda to be shaped by and to shape the policymaking agenda. So it's a very circular approach. And I think that we need to see more focused research in the global majority world and in the global north to understand how different dynamics may manifest in different contexts, but also where there are similarities, and where do policymakers in a specific context have, what tools, what strategies, what mechanisms, regulations, laws do they have to help control the system in which they are? Because unfortunately, when it comes to digital technologies and now AI, they have limited control over those unless they're willing to forego, say, allowing a certain company to operate in their market. And now I think it's much worse with AI because you've got, again, 3 American hyperscalers that dominate the cloud market. I think there could be a lot more research into what are we actually talking about with respect to AI innovation and the information ecosystem. I think the point about datification is critical because I keep asking myself, in this AI race and this innovation, are we simply innovating how much more monitoring and surveillance we can do to get even more and more data to improve our AI? So I think critical research, and to Robin's point, who is doing that research, where is that research coming from and being funded by, should really help inform how this observatory takes forward the research and policy agenda and try to really fill some of the holes that corporate funded research is not playing. I think it would also be really interesting and also probably deeply saddening to look at the amazing resource of sources and find out how many of the people and institutions that were cited no longer have funding or have been targeted by the disinformation campaign in the American government, and I'm sure that we're seeing elsewhere now. We know that a lot, the disinformation research community has been targeted by Congress, by Jim Jordan and his committee. It's becoming harder and harder to do this research. I've always had a love-hate relationship with the word disinformation. I think it's more helpful to talk about propaganda and to talk about inaccurate information, etc. But the fact is we have a field of disinformation now, but that field is under attack, as are the people in it. So I think the observatory could also help fill some of those gaps and make sure that what we have learned and the research we have done over the past several years doesn't just fade away because now those people are under attack.
Thank you, and that brings me to the final question, also building on what you just said. What are some of the biggest institutional risks, either political, capture, donor dependency, or irrelevance that you worry about? And how do you think we can mitigate them?
Well, I think the donor dependency is huge in the kind of non-academic and even some of the academic research. We heard earlier on the panel how much of this research was funded by US government entities, which is something for us to consider. And I think a big issue is the type of research that's funded, right? We saw some, I love the analysis that we did of this, that you guys did, the sources, and how much research is about like one platform and like one little part of the disinformation ecosystem. And I think that's problematic, but we see that why, because one platform had an open API, or in order to do research on specific platforms like Facebook or Instagram, you would have to have a relationship and access to that information and data from the company. And so I think that is a huge risk. I think there is a lot of research that cannot be done without partnering with that company in some way, especially as we get into AI, where it's even more opaque, and where we look at things like chatbot outputs and summarization. All of this is so opaque and so personalized and so individual. How do we even begin to do research on that? And so I think that part of the challenge going forward is designing research that gets at really important fundamental questions. And how to design that research in a way that doesn't require cooperation with platforms that then can kind of put that research at a disadvantage from an independence lens, and who's going to fund that research. And then, frankly, also linking that, the most important research should be that which is going to have a policy impact. And I think that's where the Observatory is really well placed, is to identify key research questions that need to inform policy making. I think that it's great to have academics doing their independent research on whatever, but as you look at, as politicians, as funders, as the Observatory, where's the most policy relevant? And when we talk about policy relevant for democracy, and democracy is a system of governance. And so how can we really shape a research agenda that is independent of corporate capture, that is independent of the kind of dominant frameworks in which we think about media effects or whatever, and I think trying to get at a broader array of the political economy questions that are at the root of this. But it's going to be really hard because most funders, in fact, one suggestion would be for foundations and funders to focus on funding civil society organizations and academics that do not take any corporate funding, right? And to be perfectly transparent, we don't take any corporate funding, but I say this because so much of the research, so much of the information being produced in this field is from organizations that do take corporate funding. And so then it becomes hard to set an independent advanced research agenda that moves the ball forward, because it's easy to be like, study this problem over here, content moderation, so you forget about the business models, structural issues over there.
Thank you. It is indeed hard. It's a challenge, but I think that's where the fun is also there. That's also how we see the Observatory as an interface between research and policymakers, and we think that ultimately we will get there. So, thank you so much, and back to you, Camille.
Thank you so much. We're almost on time, just 5 minutes, so thanks again for all the insights, all the wonderful conversation. I think we can stay a little bit and have some side chats if we haven't had the time, or if you haven't had the time to ask all the questions. Enjoy, there's a lot of knowledge in the room, and I hope some fruitful conversations. Thanks again for being with us.